The little French garage team had had a season of two halves for their first full campaign in F1. Early on, slow but dependable finishes, but slipping back and often off the grid entirely as more cars joined the competition later in the season. The recruitment of Roberto Moreno for their last couple of races perked up their fortunes and gave them their first point in Australia, and that was enough to get them some more sponsorship from French construction group Bouygues, who had recently branched out into media and acquired channel TF1, which broadcast Formula 1 in France. The red stripes are gone on the new chassis, the JH23, driven by Team Old Boy Philippe Streff. Streff had come off second best to Jonathan Palmer last year in the Tyrrell team's internal competition and often came off as the more erratic of the two drivers. Evidently his form over 2 years hadn't been enough to persuade Ken Tyrrell to keep him on, but he had history within the junior formulas with AGS, and with 2 years' experience in the top formula, he was a good pick for them. But whether another year at the back of the grid will harm his prospects remains to be seen. March were another team with mixed fortunes in 1987, with reliability affecting their record but good performances when they were racing. For 1988, the team's new designer Adrian Newey has produced his first ever Formula 1 car, the 881, which mounts the new Judd CV engine in the back. Two unknown quantities then, but it's gone well enough in tests that the team have expanded to two cars, with Ivan Capelli joined by Brazilian rookie Mauricio Gugelmin. Both found the cockpit very cramped, the design prioritising aerodynamic efficiency above all else, and there are some other unusual features including the slightly raised nose, the shaped end plates on the front wings, and the rear diffuser. Born into a wealthy family in the south of Brazil, Mauricio was an early convert to racing, competing in his brother's old car by 8, karting by 12, and Brazilian Formula Fiat at 17. At 19 in 1982, he followed in the footsteps of other illustrious Brazilians by heading to the UK to further his career. Sharing a home in Surrey with fellow young Brazilian Ayrton Senna, he joined West Surrey Racing in Formula 3 and took the title at his first attempt in 1985. His old friend Ayrton recommended him for the second Lotus seat the following year, but sponsors JPS preferred Johnny Dumfries, so Gugelmin went into F3000 instead. He found it a little more difficult with just one win in 2 years for the Ralt Works team, but that recommendation for Senna still helped him get a drive with the March team. Ivan Capelli had looked quite good in 1987. Although he didn't finish often, it wasn't usually his fault, and he was able to score the team's first point. He certainly made himself a popular figure in the paddock with his charm and sense of humour, and everyone wishes him well for this year. Much will depend, though, on the pace and reliability of the car, and it might well be as much a test of character as of outright ability. Despite their frustrations with the Megatron engines popping off their valves too early, the Arrows team had had a fairly good 1987 with 6 points finishes and 7th place overall. Not stellar by most standards, but Arrows' best season to date. Ross Brawn's A10 chassis has been updated to the A10B for 1988, and the team are hoping that sticking with the Megatron engines for one last year, while so many of their competitors move to atmospheric engines, will give them enough of a power advantage to improve their results further, as long as they can solve those reliability issues. The continuity extends into the cockpit as Derek Warwick and Eddie Cheever continue on driving duties. Of the two drivers, Derek Warwick definitely had the short straw in terms of reliability in 1987, with just 6 finishes, 2 of them in the points, but while running he always looked as combative as ever. There were times in the early 80s when Del Boy looked like a champion in waiting, and many sense the chance has passed him by now, but he still seems to be enjoying his racing. Eddie had had better luck than Derek last year, finishing and scoring once more than his teammate. Like Derek, he's a driver whose promise has never quite been fulfilled and whose star is probably waning now, but he gets on well with his teammate, and the pair of them have developed a healthy streak of competition on track as well. The Ford Works team, in all but name, Benetton begin the first year in the team's history going back to Tolman's arrival in 1981 without turbo engines. The new Ford DFR V8 is a development of the venerable DFV series, which will be made available to all Ford customers next year. It's still a 90-degree V8, but has been otherwise completely reworked and outputs an estimated 40 horsepower more than its predecessor and competitors, though still some 30 short of the top-of-the-range turbos. Rory Byrne's B188 reputedly mounts the biggest fuel tank ever on an F1 car at 215 litres, which might affect the weight, but the extra power should offset that. Thierry Boutsen is joined on driving duties by Alessandro Nannini, recruited after 2 fruitless years at the Little Minardi team. 2 years in the Minardi haven't shown Nannini's talent to its best advantage. In fact, he's only seen the checkered flag 5 times in his entire Formula One career so far. But he has consistently qualified well, and there were even rumours that Ferrari was sniffing around him. Benetton might not quite be at the highest level yet, but the pressure here will be much lower than at Ferrari too, so we'll see how he does. Thierry has become something of a paddock favourite over the last few years, with a pleasant, ego-free personality matched with his undoubted talent on the track, so he gets on with everyone and is a popular interviewee too. He's been considered a coming man for several years now though, and there are some who are beginning to wonder if he really does have what it takes. 1987 was another pretty barren year for the hard-working Osella squad, as once again there were no points in previous few finishes. With no money for development, the team struggle on with their elderly car and engine, though the Fiat organisation seems to have finally tired of all the negative publicity around the Alfa Romeo name, so this year those same engines will be badged as Osella, placing them, at least in theory, alongside Ferrari and Zaxpeed as joint chassis and engine constructors. There's a new chassis tweak, slightly unfortunately dubbed the FA1L, that should be available from San Marino onwards, and the team have also got a totally new colour scheme, ditching their traditional blue for white, black and yellow. Maybe they hope if they look like a Minardi it'll drive like one too. It actually seems to have gone well in testing though, clocking 300 km an hour, 186 miles an hour at Monza, and the team are actually hopeful for a change. With Alex Caffey's departure in comes Nicola Larini, whose very brief F1 career so far consists of 1 DNQ and 8 racing laps in the experimental Coloni, but just qualifying in the circumstances was achievement enough. He's also been getting good testing times too, and while it's difficult to tell much about him as a driver so far, he doesn't seem to be a total dud at least. In 1977, the eccentric and mercurial Günther Schmidt decided to promote his alloy wheels company ATS by setting them up as a Formula One team. The team collapsed in 1984 in a welter of tantrums, walkouts and court cases, and Schmidt sold the whole ATS business. With the incoming turbo ban and reduction in cost of running an F1 team, Schmidt was back, buying out an alloy wheel and rim firm, Rial, and launching them as a new team in Formula One, reuniting with his formula designer Gustav Brunner, the two presumably having made up, who had been fired by Ferrari after their 1987 car had been a bit of a disaster until rescued by John Barnard. The new Rial ARC1 bore a striking similarity to the F187 and was nicknamed the Blue Ferrari, though the shape of the back end and side pods was different as it didn't need to accommodate the bulky turbo equipment. And Brunner has gambled by giving it the smallest fuel tank on the grid to save weight. On driving duties was serial small team enabler Andrea de Cesaris. He may have largely shed his Andrea de Crasheris moniker, but the Marlboro man doesn't seem to be able to stay at even the smallest team longer than a year. It may not crash all the time, but he still doesn't seem to have the consistency and ability to finish a car that is needed. Nonetheless, as long as he gets to go racing and the teams get his Marlboro Italia money, nobody seems to really mind. A hefty sigh of relief came out of Faenza as they waved goodbye to their heavy, underpowered Motori Moderni engines at the end of 1987 to join the ranks of the normally aspirated cars and the good old DFZ, which ought to help in the reliability stakes if nothing else. The new car looks tidy enough with the now common low-profile look and bare roll bar, with its black and yellow colour scheme gratifyingly now bespattered with sponsors, though Spanish fashion brand Lois remain on board as the major sponsor, which is why the team will field the first all-Spanish driver lineup in the history of the sport, with Adrian Campos now team leader and joined by Luis Perez Sala. Campos hadn't particularly impressed in 1987, though it wasn't exactly an ideal car to impress in. He made some rookie errors, literally in the case of the opening race of the season where he was disqualified after forgetting to put his earplugs in and then taking off his helmet to rectify the error, but maybe a year's experience and hopefully a better car will give him a better shot in 1988. Barcelona-born Luis Perez Sala made the usual F1 drivers start in karting before moving to Renault 5s and then in 1983 the Alfa Sud Sprint Cup. The following year he was driving a Ralt with Alfa Romeo engines in the European F3 Championship. It was a steep learning curve, but he improved as the season went on and placed 10th overall. In 1985 he switched to Italian F3 to get more experience, but it was a very strong field and despite winning the third race of the year at Verano, he could only manage 7th overall. Not to be deterred, 1986 saw him enter International Formula 3000, paired with Minardi old boy Pierluigi Martini at Pavesi Racing. He was a consistent point scorer throughout the year, winning in Perugia and Birmingham to finish 4th overall, while Martini did better to come 2nd. A works drive with Lola was his reward, and he came runner-up to Stefano Modena in 1987. He certainly has the pedigree to be a good successor to Sandro Nannini. Ligier are another team glad to draw a line under 1987 and wave their engines goodbye. In this case, they've taken a punt on the new Judd CV, with Michel Tetou and Michel Beaujean producing a new chassis, the JS31, to house it, with a low-slung minimalist look extending to exposed cylinder heads. The fuel tanks straddle the engine fore and aft to allow the car to be even lower, and it has power steering which should assist on tight tracks. Certainly things can't get much worse for Ligier, who celebrated the 10th anniversary of their first win in F1 last year in rather muted circumstances. The driver lineup is strong though, with Arnoux joined by Stefan Johansson after the team considered several younger French drivers, including Philippe Streff, Oliver Guillard and Michel Ferté, as well as wealthy Italian Paolo Barilla. Johansson's appointment makes a lot of sense, but there are rumblings in the French press that the team don't want to become a rest home for washed-up drivers. Ligier's 1987 car was best described as a catastrophe on wheels, and it was Arnoux who scored his only point on its second race in Belgium. After that, it was just one failure after another, and Arnoux and Ghinzani put together 10 finishes between them. Despite all this, there was a sense that Arnoux is phoning it in now, and despite his undoubted pedigree, you have to wonder how many young French drivers would be doing better in the car, or at least would appreciate the chance more. Johansson's career has been an odd one, to say the least. From the obscurity of Spirit Honda, through substitute appearances for Tyrrell and Tolman, then suddenly into a Ferrari for 2 years, then a further year in a McLaren, during which time he appeared on the podium 12 times but could never quite mount the top step. Then, as suddenly as he dropped into a top team, he dropped out again. He will hope that this season with Ligier will just be a sabbatical before resuming his career, but there must be an uncomfortable sensation that it might not. With the dramatic improvement in form at the latter end of 1987, Ferrari were able to breathe a little easier and put back the debut of their new V12 atmospheric engine until it's definitely ready. This may mean later this year, or it may mean 1989. For the moment, though, the F187 chassis has been amended for the new regulations and rather clunkily dubbed the F187-88C. The smaller fuel tanks have lowered its profile and the wings have been redesigned, but otherwise it's broadly the same car, in which Berger won 2 lights-to-flag victories in Japan and Australia. Even with the new iteration of the Honda engine, this is still the most powerful car on the grid, and if they can continue putting that power to good use as they did at Suzuka and Adelaide, they could have a very good year indeed. Michele Alboreto begins his 5th year at Ferrari, hoping to regain some of the form he found in 1985 when he was challenging Alain Prost for the title. Since then, he's only managed 1 podium in 1986 and 3 in 1987, and both Stefan Johansson and Gerhard Berger have outperformed the notional team leader. This is the last year of his contract with Maranello, and if he wants it renewed, he's got some work to do. The last Austrian to drive a Ferrari, one Herr Lauda, did very well all told, and the little Alpine country seems to have found a new hero in Gerhard Berger, who took the Benetton team's first win in 1986 and then broke Ferrari's 2-year losing streak in 1987, which is 3 more wins than Alboreto managed in the same time. He will enter 1988 brimming with confidence and wanting to firmly establish himself as the new star of the team. Continuity at the Larrousse Calmel Stable 2, as Lola's Eric Broadley and the team's Chris Murphy and Hans Fuchs produce a new chassis, the LC88, to be driven by last year's final driver pairing of Dalmas and Alliot. The car will again mount the Ford Cosworth DFZ, but the team also have a development contract with Lamborghini, who are interested in building a V12 engine for a future F1 entry, perhaps as early as next year. Whether that will lead anywhere is anyone's guess, but it shows that Gerard Larousse's name still has pull in the sport and that the team are regarded as a decent prospect. Certainly, pre-season testing times are encouraging, and they go into 1988 in a positive mood. It's difficult to assess Dalmas's form in 1987 on only 3 races, but he certainly proved no slouch and would have scored points if his car had been registered. Now it is, and he'll be hoping the car allows him to repeat the feat. As with any other driver, his main battle will be with his own teammate, the experienced Alliot, and this will probably be the best way to judge him. Philippe Alliot definitely showed in 1987 that he had matured from his days as a mobile chicane in the dreadful Ram and was able to score points on 3 occasions, making the most of the Lola's good debut year. He might have been worried by Dalmas' good form in the few races he ran at the end of the year and will need to up his game to compensate. This could benefit both drivers and the team as a whole. Enzo Coloni's little team prepared to embark on their first F1 season after dipping a toe in the water at the end of 1987. Their car, the FC188, is essentially the same as their experimental 1987 entry, designed by former Dallara man Roberto Ori, slightly tweaked for the new regulations, and still mounting the Ford DFZ in the back, with prep work done by Italian engine firm Nova Motor. With Nicola Larini moving to fellow Italians Osella, Gabriele Tarquini comes the other way after making a one-race debut for them at Imola last year. Gabriele Tarquini had qualified 27th out of 26 at his debut race in Imola, but was able to start thanks to Piquet's accident, and did respectably before his gearbox gave up on lap 26. After that he returned to his F3000 berth with First Racing and picked up a couple of podium places, 3rd at Pegusa and 2nd at Imola again, to come 8th overall. It's not a stellar pedigree, but he drove for Coloni and Formula 3000 back in 1986, so at least he knows the setup there. Another group of familiar faces under a new moniker. The Euro Racing team under Gianpaolo Pavanello, who ran the Alfa Romeo Works team from 1982 to 1985, are back, combining their F1 experience with the money and organisation of Walter Brun, a former sports car driver from Switzerland who set up his own team, Brun Motorsport, in 1982. 2 years later they came 4th at Le Mans with a Porsche 956 piloted by Brun himself, American Bob Aiken, and Prince Leopold of Bavaria. And the following year they dominated the Interserie DRM Championship with Hans-Joachim Stuck driving a new Porsche 962C. 1987 began with big plans and some success, but Tom Walkinshaw's Jaguar team were going from strength to strength, and Brun found it harder going with their first winless season ever, as they finished 2nd overall. Hoping to aid his loyal driver Oscar Larrauri's ambitions to enter F1, Brun agreed to finance and lend his organisational talents to Euro Racing's new venture, named EuroBrun. Larrauri would be joined on driving duties by promising Italian youngster Stefano Modena. Oscar Larrauri came to motor racing late and didn't begin karting until he was nearly 20 years old, winning his regional championships in 1976, 77 and 79, and the provincial championship in 1976 as well. Such promise earned him the attention of none other than legendary Argentine driver Juan Manuel Fangio, and with his backing he moved into Argentine F3 in 1979 and then European F3 in 1980. 11th overall in the first season was not terrible considering he'd only just moved across the Atlantic, and then in 1981 he did much better, winning at the Nürburgring and taking 4 more podiums on his way to 5th overall, and then to Euro Racing for 1982 with their own chassis, in which he won 7 races to dominate the season. Fangio's connections even got him a Ferrari test for 1983, but his move to F2 with Minardi proved disastrous as he failed to score a point all season, and the Ferrari contract went nowhere either. During his frustrating 1983, Oscar started driving a few sports car races and did quite well, so in 1984 he signed up full-time with Walter Brun's team. Their first year was a mixed bag, and in 1985 performance improved, but retirements marred their results. However, in 1986 and 87 the team and Larrauri were up at the sharp end, and Poppy, as Oscar had become known, finished 7th overall in 1986 and competing in half a dozen different series and competitions in 1987. To these, in 1988, he will add Formula One at the grand old age of 33, alongside his other sports car commitments. Despite long being described as one to watch for the future, having done respectably in his debut at Brabham in the last race of 1987 and having been seriously considered by Benetton for their second car, there didn't seem to be a seat available for Stefano Modena in 1988. Instead, his former F3 team Euro Racing came calling, and while it was anybody's guess whether the new EuroBrun would do well, at least he'd get some experience under his belt and be in a position to make the most of his promise in the future. Another team who have decided to have their chassis built by an outside firm and have ended up with a bit of a mouthful of a name. Steel magnate Beppe Lucchini had been involved with Osella in the early 80s, and in 1983 he formed his own team, Brixia Motorsport, BMS, to enter Italian rallying, with first Alfa Romeo and then Lancia cars, then moving into the inaugural World Touring Car Championship as well in 1987. only for Alfa Romeo to pull the rug out from under him by withdrawing from the entire series amid controversy after the European rounds. So, taking stock, Lucchini made an abrupt left turn and decided to enter Formula One instead, adopting the patriotic name of Scuderia Italia and choosing Rosso Corsa as their colour. Having never built a racing car, having always used customer cars in the past, he sensibly contracted Gianpaolo Dallara, a successful constructor of lower formula chassis, to build the new car. Former Brabham designer Sergio Rinland drew up the new car, and the talented Alex Caffey was recruited to drive. Alex Caffey's first full season in F1 hadn't seen much in the way of results. He was driving an Osella after all, but he had proved level-headed and reliable with not a single retirement due to driver error or accidents. Unfortunately, that just meant 15 retirements for mechanical reasons, as he only saw the checkered flag once, at Imola, which must have sapped his morale. He's probably in for more of the same at the new Scuderia Italia, but for their part he's a great fit.